if I'm right in reading this, Valentin Gerlier will be talking to us about Plato, love, language, and the truth of things. So first, a few words about Valentin. He's a teacher, novelist, and musician, and has lectured for the William Blake Society and for the Prince's School of Traditional Arts. He's also a member of the academic board of the Temenos Academy. So, if I'm right in reading what this lecture will be about, it will in a way tie into what Joseph's first lecture was talking about, which is how can we speak about wisdom? How can we speak about truth and about the good life? In what manner of speech are these approached? And the link between the metaphysical and the ethical considerations for Plato might well be a manner of speaking, which is a manner of speaking of a lover. So the language of love is that which discloses the metaphysical as well as the ethical dimension in Plato's thought. And for much more on that, please welcome Valentin.
Hello. Sorry I was not with you this morning, but I have a terrible backache. And actually it's a little known fact that Socrates suffered from sciatica. Did you know that? Anyway, one of the side effects of one of the painkillers I'm on is euphoria. So if I break up in sudden dancing, you'll know why. Right, essential. Thank you, Aristotle. Right. So love, language, and the truth of things. Can you all hear me? Reading Plato can be a daunting experience, though many assure us that he is the greatest philosopher of all time, and that the entire history of philosophy consists in footnotes to Plato. Plato's writings remain, to a large extent, somewhat mysterious. And this is, I imagine, the way he would have wanted it, since he never tells us directly what he thinks, but intertwines his ideas in dramas and speeches that he puts in the mouth of colourful characters. Yet his works are complex, but they are not obscure. They don't require incredible amounts of expert knowledge and technical vocabulary, like perhaps some contemporary philosophy. Instead, as I'm sure we've heard this morning, they address questions that seem of importance to each of us in our daily lives. Plato's dialogues often begin with, or at least are centered around, these sweeping but also very straightforward questions. Questions of love and death, of courage and justice, of truth and beauty, of soul, city, and cosmos. These questions are never really fully answered in the dialogue, but rather function like open doors, thresholds into labyrinths, where we can get lost and find ourselves again at a completely different place from that in which we started. Helping us to get lost or found, perplexed or moved, Plato is already at work, since for him the most important participant of his dialogues are, of course, you and I, the readers. Plato means for us to read these dialogues actively, to stop and think, to consider closely what's been said, who is saying it, and what might be their purpose in saying this. He means for us to realize that we are not merely reading a treatise stating someone's ideas, but a complex literary work, polyphonic in its voices, but symphonic in its approach. A work that speaks to us through multiple kinds of language tropes, from the mathematical to the mythic, from the comedic to the tragic, from the rhetorical to the philosophical. So with that in mind, I want in this lecture to offer a short venture through one of those open doors, through one threshold into the labyrinth, and follow one golden thread, which is the mythic. And I want to suggest ways in which this myth-centered way of writing and of conceiving language is in fact related to other voices, other aspects of his work, and is thus integral to Plato's symphonic philosophy. Now, as we know, Plato's work do contain a number of myths, and he creates some and he adapts others to his purposes. But there is in fact more to Plato than many myths. There is a fundamentally mythic light that glows within his works as a whole. Indeed, I venture that each of his dialogues occurs within a mythic setting, and as such has a profound symbolic dimension. Part of Plato's literary genius is that he skillfully confounds the symbolic and the literal in such a way that things can say what they say and more than what they say, and words can be themselves and more than themselves all at once. Now the Greeks, as I'm sure you all know, don't really have a special word for myth. Mythos simply means story and can refer to anything conveyed by word of mouth. The beauty of this sweeping definition is that it already silently makes us aware that to all language belongs a mythic component, that even the simplest speech is somehow suffused in myth. Really, to understand myth as intertwined in the fabric of speech is to be alive to the mythic dimension of words. Unfortunately, we're accustomed from centuries of reductionist education and rationalist philosophy and scientism to consider words in an atomistic way, as bits of data used to communicate inner states or thoughts between writers and readers. Unless we're poets or lovers of poetry, it's hard for us to naturally and immediately envisage just how rich a word can be. I was told that the doorways to medieval cathedrals are tall and wide so that those who enter can come in with the entirety of their soul and not leave anything behind. But I doubt whether the soul of a word could be contained by an entire cathedral. To be aware of this mythic dimension of words is to encounter the soul of words, and not merely their immediate, descriptive, or accepted meanings. Now, Plato lived in a civilization that had grounded its traditions in its poets and in the words of their great tales. Such poetic understanding was, by the time of Plato, ailing, and had become more platitudinal than deeply felt. A problem that can help us to understand, to a certain degree, Plato's attitudes to the poets in the Republic. But as a writer who writes within a culture that is intertwined with myth at such a deep level, Plato cannot but have been deeply aware of the mythic and symbolic glow of words, of the words he was using. And surely, I might add, this is something that great poets and philosophers all share. This is because the mythic is the golden world of the philosophical. The heavens, Eden, or promised land that all true philosophical reflection begins from, seeks to articulate, and to which it longs to return. Reflection on truth, beauty, or justice are more than cogitations about abstract principles, but core philosophy on a quest, a journey that suggests and ends in a transcendent telos, something at once interwoven in the fabric of this world, yet also lighting it from beyond. So with that in mind, we now turn to the beginning of the Republic and attempt to see how mythic language is used not only to make reference to a myth, but to frame the whole work, the whole Republic, within the context of a myth. So I think you have the first little extract that I want you to have a look at. So we're doing a bit of close reading here, so I'm going to read it out with you, but it's very much worthwhile to pay attention to every word, because every word in this beginning, in this opening, is important. So as we remember, the Republic, the entire Republic, is told by Socrates, and which attests to his magnificent memory, which I'm sure was a side effect of his sciatica. So Socrates begins the Republic and he says, I went down yesterday to Piraeus with Glaucon. Notice he said to Piraeus, not to the Piraeus. I went down yesterday to Piraeus with Glaucon, Ariston's son, to pray to the goddess, wanting at the same time to see the way that they were going to hold the festival, since they were now conducting it for the first time. The parade of the local residents seemed to me beautiful, while no less worthy appeared the one put on by the Thracians. And having prayed and having seen, we turned back towards the city. As we were heading homeward, Polemarchus, the son of Cephalus, caught sight of us from a distance and ordered his slave to run and order us to wait for him. And grabbing me from behind by my cloak, the slave said, Polemarchus orders you to wait. So the first words of the Republic, I went down, in Greek, kateben, resound with Homeric overtones. Indeed, the great poet uses the very same phrasing in the Odyssey to refer to a journey in the underworld. For example, famously in Book 23, when Odysseus describes his trials and tribulations to his wife Penelope, he says, I went down, kateben, into the house of Hades to inquire concerning the return of my companions and myself. The word Piraeus also suggests the Greek he peraie, if I'm even close to pronouncing that right. We'll never know. But he peraie means the land beyond. So that the particular place Piraeus is also the place beyond life. That is, the afterlife. The land of the dead, the house of shades, Hades itself. And of course in the Republic, there are several places where we find ourselves in a house of shades. One is famously the cave in the well-known allegory, which constitutes the book's center. The other house of shades is also significant. It is at the end of Book 10 and has to do with the myth of and the visit of in the underworld. The myth of which concludes the Republic, is an account of the cosmos, of the afterlife, and of the rewards and punishments that are dealt to and chosen by just and unjust souls after death. At the very end of the myth, returns to life. That is, he goes up, being charged with telling humankind what he has seen and learnt in the afterlife with regards to justice. So we have a book that begins with a way down and ends with a way up, and is structured around a central story in which a prisoner who becomes a philosopher goes up and goes down. There is a close relationship here between a journey to the darkness and a journey to the light. In fact, the light of the sun outside the cave, being situated roughly in the middle of the book, is also the glowing, luminescent center of the Republic as a whole. Odysseus entering Hades as a crucial adventure on his journey towards his homeland is also Socrates entering Piraeus, ultimately bound on his homeward journey, the journey to the light of truth. Like Odysseus, Socrates enters Hades to inquire how his companions and himself can achieve such return. This richness of suggestive imagery in the Republic's first 3 words attests to the famous story told by Diogenes Laertius that Plato rewrote this beginning many times. So we have an important beginning to a book, but why are the words "I went down"? Why are the words "I went down" so important to the spirit of Plato? And we can distinguish a great thread in the Platonic dialogues involving Socrates. There's a crucial difference between dialogues in which Socrates is required or forced to do something, and those in which he himself chooses to do something. We notice here that what he chooses to do is to go down. What he is forced to do, constrained by Polemarchus' servant first, and later by Aristodemus and by Glaucon's enthusiasm, is to stay down for a while. So let's stay for a moment with Socrates' initial choice. Unconstrained, of his own accord, he goes down to Piraeus. It seems that Socrates, the one who genuinely loves the truth, who genuinely regards wisdom, wanders freely the road down as well as the road up. We know from the Symposium and the Phaedrus that what makes Socrates move at all is his eros, his love of wisdom. Wisdom, it would seem then, seems something that calls the philosopher to the heavens and also calls him to Hades. So the order of the heavens, where goodness and beauty are, is also, in another sense, the pattern of truth in Hades, where goodness and beauty also are, but in another way. Perhaps then, the motif of ascent that we find in the famous allegory of the cave as the goal of the philosopher might have been overemphasized or misunderstood. In the light of Neoplatonic interpretations and later readings, the motif of ascent seems to imply that the philosopher must escape this world and cling to a precious otherworldly truth, a kind of expert knowledge of the heavens, from which he can then pour scorn on the dark and muddy concerns of our overly materialistic world. But if this were so, Socrates' first words would be, "I went up," and the whole Republic would be finished there and then. Instead, we hear that Socrates goes down, but he goes down in order to pray to the goddess. The love of wisdom in its downward movement is here shown to be a matter of piety. Piety is the context of the downward philosophical journey, which means, likewise, that lack of piety will be the context in which philosophy cannot go upwards. This serves to contextualize the great debate between Socrates, for whom true philosophy is also true reverence to the gods, and his opponents or enemies, those who are not pious, the sophists. The sophists are those in Hades who venerate not the goddess, but opinions, and who thus regurgitate something that sounds like wisdom, but in fact is the very opposite. For it does not come from the soul's living light, and is thus poison to the soul. The sophists, caught in Hades and dwelling within the realm of clever opinions and the dead or dying traditions of Athens, have no wish to go up, because they do not know there is an up. They have no love of wisdom, no eros for philosophy. They do not go down to Hades, but live in Hades and seek to rule it, unaware that the goddess is there. They are the impious ones. So going back to Piraeus, the harbour of Athens, which we're saying is also Hades, we note that the local inhabitants, who were at the time of Plato not only Athenians, but many foreigners as well, are all intertwined in a celebration that also involves those of another land, Thrace. And their own celebration, the Thracians, as we read from the extract, appears to Socrates no less beautiful. There's a positive and a negative side to this. The negative side is that the celebration to the goddess has been diluted into any celebration. That every celebration to the goddess appears like a good celebration. So in some sense, the right praise of and reverence to the gods, which means the right way of speaking about and speaking to that which is sacred, is obscured in Hades. In some sense, souls are in Hades because they have lost this genuine and pious connection with that which is sacred. This mirrors very well the Athens of Plato's day, at least it mirrors very well how Plato portrays Athens in Plato's day, in which the sophists obscure the right relationship with what is sacred by using speech impiously, that is, instrumentally, as a means to gain influence, political power, and prestige, rather than to reverently seek the truth. Now, this situation occurs also because of the Athenian traditionalists, those who revere the poets and repeat their words with no profound understanding of what those words mean, but only repeat them because they are traditionally accepted as good. This is well mirrored in the Republic in the character of Cephalus, the father of Polemarchus, and the first man to whom Socrates speaks about justice. Cephalus, in fact, delivers a very traditionalistic account of justice. And though Socrates respects Cephalus, it's interesting to notice how quickly Cephalus retires once the discussion becomes overtly philosophical and the question of justice is raised as a matter of concern. Like the Athenians of his age, Cephalus has no concern for philosophy. Well, what's interesting is that Cephalus, the old traditionalist, is the father of a young person there at the debate. And yet Cephalus is very different from the energy that the young people present have. They all have benefited to some degree from a sophistic education. We even have a famous sophist among those present, Thrasymachus, and the refutation of his knowingly outrageous views on justice occupies much of Book 1. And I don't know if you remember his sort of arguments. It's somewhat unclear whether Thrasymachus genuinely thinks that he's right or is arguing ironically with Socrates. But in some way it doesn't matter. In both cases there's something profoundly sophistical about his approach. So there's a law here that Plato is suggesting. Just as an ailing Athens has become dominated by dead traditions upheld by injustice and sophistry, the old dormant gentry of Athens, Plato seems to tell us, give birth to young sophists, impatient minds trained in the manipulations of language, the worship of the shades in Hades, the instrumental use of appearances to further their standing in the city. Now that to me sounds familiar, because it very much sounds like the state of education now. There's something universal about Plato, and if there weren't, we really shouldn't be reading him. This break between the old and the young is an educational crisis in Athens, but also the story of a downfall of mythic proportion, the downfall of the human soul. This is something which is depicted in mythic literature as a chronicle. A chronicle usually portrays the fall of an age. Comical versions of this rupture between old and young can be glimpsed in the literature of the time, for example in Aristophanes' plays, The Clouds and the Wasps. But there are, I think, more useful to our purposes to kind of think about this myth, there are more modern and more tragic versions of this myth. This collapse of the handing down of living truth between the old and the young can be glimpsed, for example, in Shakespeare's King Lear. Here, Lear and Gloucester play the part of Cephalus, as they both hold up traditions in name only, but are in themselves no longer just. While the young, personified by the charismatic but ruthless young sophist Edmund, set about manipulating language in order to appropriate the world for themselves. Even more recently and more alarmingly, in Dostoevsky's Demons, the great novelist portrays the downfall of Russia and foreshadows the rise of Marxist-Leninism as the result of the absence of discernment in the old elite, who are intellectually dormant and philosophically and spiritually complacent. And in fact, they encourage the young in their cynical sophistry and particular forms of demonic iconoclasm. We thus have in that book tragically funny scenes in which these intellectual salons set up by the old elite host these young philosophers who deliver scathing, cynical destructions of the traditions upheld by the old, while the old people present, completely unwise to the joke, applaud the young for their intellectual boldness, while congratulating each other for hosting groundbreaking culture. This is comical and tragic at once, very, very typically Russian. But the whole situation tragically ends in the suicide of the young sophist, or at least one of the leading characters. So we're back to our extract now. We're thinking about this mingling of rituals, where the Thracian parade appears just as beautiful as the local residents' parade. That is the disease of Hades, a lack of discernment and distinction, which, to speak the language of piety, is in fact a curious form of idolatry, an undiscerning worship of appearances. This parade is also the parade that later reappears in the cave, as the parade of objects that are held up for the prisoners to behold, or for them to behold the shadows. This form of undiscerning idolatry is shown by Plato as the blindness that enables the sophists to rule. This unseeing state of affairs, where everything is mixed into everything else, is what I would call a sense of negative universality. It is the rule of doxa, opinion. But intertwined into this, and the intertwining here is ever so important, is a positive universality. The fact that all human beings are in fact here, joined together in a celebration of the goddess. So there's Athenians, there's Piraeans, there's Thracians, all kinds of people live in the Piraeus. All human beings are in a relationship with the goddess. Now the goddess in Piraeus was Artemis. But of course, Artemis is a particular goddess. We know that Plato's goddess is truth herself. This means that all human beings are in a relationship with the truth, and all human beings have a pre-intellectual fundamental orientation to the truth of things. Truth is their native land, their natural habitat. If we think about it, that is how Socratic conversation is at all intelligible. All human beings have within them the spark of wisdom, the possibility to reflect on things, to engage in debate with Socrates, and perhaps even to fall in love with wisdom. It is this falling in love, this awakening of the spark, this rousing of eros, that will be the way up to the homeland. But philosophy happens not in the heavens, but in this universal intertwining of shades in Hades. This in-between is signified in Plato by the Greek metaxou. And I must acknowledge a debt to Simone Weil, whose very enlightening reading of Plato has led me in this direction. So the following is a little bit sort of rehearsing her argument. So the Greek metaxou, that signifies in between, and it becomes more later on takes on a more technical, philosophical shape. The term methexis, which means participation, which I'm sure has been mentioned before, a term that Neoplatonic philosopher and Christian theologians used to describe the ineffable relationship between the one and the many, or God and creation. They like what I'm saying, obviously. So this idea of the in-between, it's kind of a dramatic interlude. It's very Platonic. So, as we are in Hades, I'll continue. This intermingling is where wisdom can show herself in Hades. So we're staying with this idea of the metaxou, the in-between. It is the in-betweenness that is evoked by the priestess Diotima in the Symposium, where she shows that Eros, love, is not an otherworldly god, but a daimon, a spirit that works in between the divine and mortal realms, that leads the soul to the beautiful, to wisdom and the highest good. The spiritual for Diotima is that in-between realm between the divine and the mortal. Philosophy then happens in this participatory in-between, amidst the things of life, in media res, midway upon the journey of our life, to quote Dante here out of context. How so? Simply because wisdom and truth cannot be dissociated from the genuine questions of life. If the question, what is justice, for example, is of mere passing interest, or worse, is inquired into only so that one can gather an opinion that accords with what many people say, and thus advances one's standing in Athenian society, the way of truth is shut. There is no way up. There has to be genuine concern. And genuine concern is we're approaching here what Plato means by piety. So this is, in Platonic terms, philosophy without piety. And that is what sophistry is. A pious question comes from a proper relationship with the goddess, because it moves from a deep, sincere, and enduring concern to know, because one's whole being is set to work by this quest, and there is a genuine thirst and longing for wisdom that clever answers will not abate. In other words, one's eros is directed to wisdom herself, moved in some sense by wisdom herself. This movement always starts in our existential situations, when one becomes aware that one dwells in the house of shades. Only then can light be glimpsed. Only when you see that you're in the darkness can you start glimpsing the light. This is a yearning that is also wonder. It is the beginning of reverence for truth and the opening of our eyes. This is why Socrates in our extract says, having prayed and having seen, he is ready to return. So the dialogue is set in Hades, which is the place where souls seek to learn about justice and pay for their unjust deeds. Thus the whole relationship to justice is evoked right from the beginning of the dialogue. The question of justice sweeps over the course of our lives and is what is at stake in our lives. Thus in the Republic, Socrates' first conversation, I'll go back to that first conversation, is with Cephalus, who as an older man looks back on his life as he prepares for his journey to the afterlife and he attempts to articulate what he feels justice might be. So justice is the lens through which one views the whole of one's life, one's relationship to oneself, to the city, and to the gods. So interestingly, if we stay with this mythic image, the question of justice, which is the question of a pious relationship to all things, has to be approached before the way back up, the way homeward, the way to truth, is attempted. So it's the question of justice first, must be approached first before the rise to truth. And as we saw a moment ago, the question of justice is not Socrates' question, but that of those young souls who dwell in Hades, and they compel and force him to inquire with them. Just like the souls that want to address Odysseus in Hades, they will not let Socrates go until he can take them along with him on the journey back home out of Hades. They want him, in other words, to shine the light of wisdom on the question which dominates the House of Shades, the question of justice, so that they themselves, the souls in Hades, can pay their dues and move towards the light. What does this mean? Let's turn to our second extract, which is just a few lines further in the Republic. And Adeimantus said to Socrates, have you all got that second extract? I'll give you a clue, it's just after the first extract. And Adeimantus said, don't you know that there will be a torch race at nightfall on horses for the goddess? On horses, I said. That's something new. While they hold torches, will they pass them to one another in a relay race on horses, or how do they mean it? That way, said Polemarchus. And they're also going to have an all-night festival that will be worth seeing. We're going to rouse ourselves up after dinner and see the all-night festival, and we'll be with many of the young people at it and talk with them. Just stay and don't do anything else. And Glaucon said, it seems to be something one has got to stay for. Well, if it seems good, I said, that's what one ought to do. So, just illustrating again, it's not really his choice to be there. It's the others that are saying, come on, we're staying. So we see that the festival takes place at night, but there is a relay of torches, which is something new. The lighting of a flame and the relay from horseman to horseman, all in honor of the goddess, is the image of Socratic paideia, education. The light, that is the light of the sun that shines outside the cave, the light of truth and wisdom, also lights up in Hades, like flames in the night. Thus the darkness also hosts the light, but in the manner of a relay, rather than a permanent, enduring shining. The relay of torches is also the symbolic image of the Socratic dialogue, the rhythm of seeking and finding, of question and answer. The lighting of the flame and the passing of the flame occurs in the middle of the relay, once again in between the things of life, metaxou, and is a participatory event. See, the speaking of truth then is not a pronouncing of particular words which are always the same and which can be spoken at any moment and in the same way and mean the same thing. If this were so, there would be no relay. There would just be one light. And it wouldn't be a celebration to the goddess. It wouldn't be dedicated to anything else. Instead, the speaking of truth is a sacred and unique event, like the festival dedicated to the goddess, in which words spoken, whilst in themselves unequal to truth, are nonetheless made luminous with the light of truth as they are passed. The speaking of truth is an event that takes place in the middle of the relay of torches. In fact, it is the relay of torches. That is the particular dynamic spirit of a Platonic dialogue. It offers no terminal definition of what the truth is, but a relay of light, a bringing the light of Paideia to the journeys and deeds in Hades. No finite doctrine is being presented, but rather a light is being shone on things. The Socratic Paideia is not the passing of a teaching, but the shining of a light, to paraphrase Yeats. In the Republic, the all-night festival is also the dialogue that will seek to found the famous just city in speech, that Adeimantus, Glaucon, and the others that are present at that gathering all seek to participate in. Thus Glaucon, Polemarchus, Adeimantus, the souls of the young in Hades, all compel Socrates to stay. In that compelling, there's the beginning of a thirst, an eros that longs to find the way to the light. But it is a compelling that comes from those who will learn with him and not from Socrates himself. This is because the light of wisdom, the light of education, must remain free to move from question to question, while being tied to none of them. So, we have the young souls that through the all-night festival, that is the dialogue, wish to light the torch, or have their torch lit, so that they can find the way up. But we also have the philosopher, who, as I said before, takes the way down. In the myth of the cave, the ascent to the light of the good is presented to Glaucon and Adeimantus because their way is up. But Socrates' way is down. We are here reminded of the famous fragment of Heraclitus, Hodos ano kato. That's practice my ancient Greek. The upward downward way. Or as the fragment is translated, the upward way and the downward way is one and the same. This upward downward way brings up again the notion of metaxou, the participatory in-between. For the cosmic questions include both directions, justice in life and justice in the afterlife. The Republic, concerned with the knowing of what justice is set, in some sense, in the afterlife, in Hades, and so moves towards life, only to conclude once again with a myth of the afterlife. So this afterlife, too, must be interpreted as a mythic image, and understood to refer to the ultimate ground of justice, that to which justice is directed, the father or mother of justice. What does this mean? As in every Platonic dialogue, no question is settled without a way to find a relationship to the transcendent source that moves the question and from which the question comes. This, in a way, is one of the mysteries of Plato's philosophy, that no question is intelligible without its transcendent ground, a ground that remains blurred, mysterious, ineffable, and yet is glimpsable during the relay of torches, during the dialogue. If we stick with the Republic, we see that justice can never be, in other words, the product of the human intellect, or the possession of the human intellect, as the sophists would like it to be. All reflections on justice, if they are to be pious, full of genuine concern, must ultimately have to do with this transcendent source, that which from beyond, in the afterlife, lights up the things of this life. This is one of the meanings of the word eidos, which we translate as forms or ideas, but really means in the Greek the way something looks or appears. So the idea of justice, the transcendent and the afterlife, is really inseparable from the glimpse of justice that we get in the relay of torches. And this visionary glimpse appears and disappears throughout the dialogue. To stay with the particular image that we've been looking at, the relay of torches is already a glimpse of the eidos. We see that, as in the relay of torches, justice appears amidst philosophical dialogue. It somehow needs the participants of the dialogue to inquire together. This surely is a political image, in that it has to do with the polis. Plato is already saying, inquiring together with a pious and reverent, genuine concern is the polis. And thus, it is, in some sense, to be in the right relationship with justice. But the sacred source, justice itself, evoked by the symbol of the afterlife, evoked by the dialogue, remains beyond, like the sun outside the cave. So the right relationship to justice is a relationship to all things seen in the light of their sacred source. Philosophy, like Diotima's eros, the in-between daimon, is the in-between daimon because it considers the earthly things in the light of the divine, the way up, and considers the divine in the shadow of the earthly, the way down. The way up shows how appearances, the shades of Hades, appear as deficient of the light, which is the ground of all appearances, the sun, or form of the good. The way down shows how the light shines through all the appearances and can be glimpsed, as in eidos, through all appearances. Thus, appearance and reality are once again really intertwined, and wisdom is born in the middle of this intertwining. As Simone Weil writes, the essence of created things is to be intermediaries. They are intermediaries leading from one to the other, and there is no end to this. Now she's referring to a different tradition. She's talking about created things, so she's speaking from a Christian point of view, but her concept of it, this intermediary, is entirely built on Plato's idea of the in-between, the metaxou. Our final image here is light. The light that shines outside the cave, the sun that is also the good beyond being. Plato sees the light that emanates from this passage at the center of the dialogue to be a light that shines in both directions, backwards to the beginning and forwards to the end. And thus the light in the middle of the dialogue illuminates the entire work in both directions. Now, every Platonic dialogue, I suggest, though I invite you to put this to the test, in fact, I invite you to put all of this to the test. Every Platonic dialogue has a center which radiates outwards in both directions. Thus, the book cannot be read to its end in order to find the answer, since there is no end to philosophical dialogue. Neither, in some sense, is there a beginning. There is rather a rising and a falling, an ascent towards and a downward move away from the pulsating heart of the dialogue. But if the light of the good is at the center of this work, it also tells us something fundamental about philosophy, that philosophy shines light on things rather than giving us knowledge about things. The light that shines outside the cave and the light of the torches is the same light. That is, a light is shone on the entire conversation of the Republic, which means that it is a good conversation, an auspicious one, in some sense, a just one. As already just, the Republic is a philosophical conversation that sheds light on the soul seeking for justice, that sheds light on the polis deficient of justice, and sheds light on a cosmos that is itself an attempt to embody justice, all the while without providing any knowledge. It's worth noting that those who condemn Socrates to death men such as Meletus and Anytus. And Anytus appears in Plato's work, I think in the Meno, and I would recommend reading what Anytus has to say he's a good classic Athenian traditionalist character, but he does put Socrates to death as highly significant, symbolic. So it's worth noting that those who condemn Socrates to death, men such as Meletus and Anytus, are those who believe that the building of a just city in speech, like they do in the Republic, is in fact a lack of piety. It is sophistry, a lack of proper acknowledgement of the gods. The city as they see it is in fact already just and does not need light to be shed upon it, as it is itself light. Their version of the truth is not something that comes to be seen, a glimpse of light in Hades, but secure knowledge about the gods and about Athens. It is, in other words, settled, irrefutable doctrine. They are in Hades and intend to stay there, and see Socrates' homeward journey as an affront. It's from Hellenistic philosophy onwards that Plato's writings begin to be seen more in their aspect as doctrine than as a way of bringing light to questions. But just as we've learnt from being spectators of the relay of torches alongside Socrates and his friends, we also intuitively know that the House of Shades is the place where the light can be glimpsed. The relationship between appearance and reality, then, is far more subtle and dynamic than may have been supposed by some Platonic commentators. This relationship is intimated very clearly in the Timaeus. And if you must all be very familiar with all of Plato's works. In fact, I'm sure everything I'm saying is things you already know. But I'm sure you remember that the Timaeus is the great myth, the great cosmological myth in Plato, and is often referred to as such. And in fact, for many centuries, that was, at least in the Latin West, that was the only bit of Plato they knew. And only a part of it at that. So it's interesting how Plato gets interpreted throughout the centuries, but that will be another lecture. So we notice that the Timaeus is a very long speech by an esteemed friend of Socrates who appears to be an enthusiastic follower of Pythagoras. I think it's very interesting that Plato never puts long cosmological speeches in Socrates' mouth. Generally speaking, Socrates, the daimon of philosophy, is not a friend of big speeches, whereas his enemies, the sophists, delight in them. Socrates is in fact the embodiment, the personification of that in-between described by Diotima. And as such, there is an immediate energy and eros to his character that does not suit certain modes of inquiry. We can suggest as a general rule that where there are big speeches in Plato, the spirit of Socratic philosophy is being obscured. But that is not always a bad thing. Where something is being obscured, something else comes to light. As we've seen, knowledge in its downward aspect intimates an interplay between clarity and obscurity, darkness and light. Now, as he sets out his great song of the universe, Timaeus himself tells us that he's not practicing philosophy in a Socratic sense, but only creating a likeness, an image, what he calls a likely story or a likely myth. Timaeus' account of the cosmos is not a scientific account of the cosmos. It is first and foremost a myth, a story of the cosmos and how it comes to be. So if I can turn your attention now to the last, but not least, extract for us to consider. And I'll just read it out for us. Timaeus says, "There's every necessity that this cosmos here be the likeness of something." So then, when it comes to the likeness and its model, one must determine how the accounts are also akin to those very things which the accounts are interpreted, of which the accounts are interpreted. But for accounts made as a likeness of something else, since it is a likeness, it is fitting that they, in proportion to their objects, be likenesses. Just as being is to becoming, so is truth to trust. Timaeus the mythmaker tells us that the whole cosmos is a likeness, and that therefore the right way of speaking of a likeness is through a likeness, a story, a myth. If the whole cosmos is itself a likeness, a threshold through which being shines, the whole endeavor of philosophy corresponds to that part of ourselves that understands that likenesses are intelligible. In other words, we respond to the mythical and the symbolic because something in us knows that symbolic and mythical language is intelligible and meaningful. This is what Timaeus means when he says, just as being is to becoming, so is truth to trust. His whole account of the cosmos depends on trust, the Greek term for which is pistis. I promise it's the last Greek term for today. From me, anyway. This term became, in the later Koine Greek of the New Testament, the word for faith. I think that's quite interesting. So there's not an overt religious dimension, or at least not in the same sense in Plato, but it becomes later charged with religious meaning, or rather, Christian meaning. This surely should strike us as strange. What does trust have to do with knowledge? Don't philosophers precisely seek for understanding, in Greek noesis, so I've just lied because there's one more term here, and leave faith or trust behind? Isn't trust just a lower kind of knowledge, a mere belief in the partial reliability of appearance until we get to the truth of things? But the trust that Timaeus invokes here is not any kind of cognition. It is the condition for the possibility of cognition. Pistis refers to the simple and yet profound sense, a pre-cognitive, pre-intellectual sense, if you will, that the cosmos as it appears is intelligible and meaningfully ordered. In a simple way, trust can't be ascertained, neither can it be doubted, because that which ascertains and doubts is the intellect, and that depends on pistis. This is why Timaeus the mythmaker, in his making a cosmic image, relies on trust as a bridge from being to becoming, as a way into truth. The likely myth, Timaeus' cosmic image, is compelling because it honors the basic intelligibility of things, and therefore turns towards appearance and becoming with reverence. In other words, for Plato, truth comes to be glimpsed in an image, whether in the myth of the Republic or the likely story of the Timaeus. Pistis is that within us which understands that truth and its likeness share a profound kinship. To understand that that which is intelligible is expressed through that which is visible and sayable is to attest reverently to the togetherness of particular and universal, to the intertwining, the in-between of immanent things and the transcendent principles which are the mothers and the fathers of things. Trust in the cosmos, rather than its denigration in favor of some kind of cognitive exclusivity, is in fact essential to Plato's philosophy. For pistis is how we can glimpse the truth amidst the appearance, the light amidst the shades of Hades. It is how we can understand the stories and images of the Republic as pointing to something other than themselves. But that other than themselves is also themselves. It is once again the dialectic between darkness and light that renders all things intelligible. As I said at the beginning, the philosopher takes the way down because the way down is good. And there he prays to the goddess with reverence. Pistis then is the reverent, intuitive sense of the all and of the meaningfulness of the all. For Plato then, noesis and pistis, understanding and trust, come together and are impossible without one another. This is why the notion of the in-between is so central to his work and provides philosophical depth and richness, reverence and discernment, trust and understanding, being and becoming must be contemplated together in their manifold interaction. The dissolution of noesis and pistis that begins in later Hellenistic philosophy creates this sense that we're familiar with, that truth for Plato is something like an absolute intellectual thought, and trust is simply a partly correct, partly mistaken belief, a lower form of knowledge that must be overcome. This dissolution transformed Plato into a dualist and philosophy into a largely ineffective enterprise. Philosophy now becomes akin to sophistry, reduced to mere opinions about things, and once again, there is no way up. But this happens, as I hope to have shown somewhat, because the symbolic, the mythical dimension of Plato is largely lost. And I'm arguing here that returning to the symbolic, mythical dimension is essential to really grasp not just the words of Plato, but the spirit of Plato. So through this window into depth and richness of myth, I hope we've seen how language and the truth of things subtly tie together in Plato. Though I've only touched on the Republic here, the numerous Platonic myths, as well as the mythical setting of Platonic dialogue, are inexhaustibly fruitful ways into considering the richness of what Plato is doing and pointing towards. This pointing towards the patterns in the heavens is also revealing of the patterns of Hades. Philosophical dialogue, the relay of torches, is an in-between which opens up a vista to the light enduring, the nourishing sun that feeds all beings and enables a flowering in the soul, in the city, in the cosmos. Thank you.
Thank you, Valentin. And I suppose we should all take the road down to Hades more often now.
Yeah.
We've got about 15 minutes, so I'd just like to open the floor for questions.
You said, so I get the quote right.
Yeah.
Memory. The upward way and the downward way are one and the same. Was that,
Heraclitus.
you haven't said it.
Yes, that's one way, yes.
Yeah. And what, that was a quote from somewhere?
Heraclitus, yeah, one of the so-called pre-Socratics. Fragment B60. I think that's right. One of his fragments, I think it's B60.
Thank you.
I welcome comments, or if you have other things that are related to, yes.
Do you say that everyone has some sort of relationship with the goddess?
Yeah.
Can you think of some kind of equivalent to the goddess in today's society?
Right, well, I mean, the goddess, I'm starting with the idea of the goddess that is in Piraeus, who is interestingly a goddess of Artemis. So she's many things, but one of the things she is a moon goddess, or a goddess of change. So this is how truth appears in Hades, in Piraeus, or in the world that we live in. It's a kind of changeable aspect to it. But I think for Plato, the goddess becomes the goddess with a capital G. I think it becomes, or she becomes truth herself, if you will. So I think there's a suggestion that the universality, because all the people in Piraeus, there's a kind of, it's a really non-Greek place in a kind of polis sense, because it's got so many people in it from very many different places. And I think that attests to the universality of our journey towards truth. In other words, I think it's a principle in Plato that all human beings are somehow oriented towards truth, whether they choose that way or not, or even know it or not. It is kind of there as a precondition for humankind. It's almost as though we have no choice. It's truth first, and then humans come out of truth, like come out of a womb.
It's more of a comment than a question. So you mentioned how piety was kind of the first act that Socrates told down to the Piraeus.
Yeah.
Just talking about the sophists in Thus Spake Zarathustra, the whole journey.
Sorry, say that again?
In Thus Spake Zarathustra.
Yes, yes, I've heard of him.
He goes up to the mountain.
Yes.
And pours down his skull and he comes back
Yes.
down.
Yeah.
So it's just an inversion.
Exactly. Yes. So that's a very good point. I was tempted to mention something like that. Yeah, because I think in Nietzsche, those that go to heaven, the first thing they do is start to ridicule those that are in hell. Am I right? I seem to remember something like that. There's a kind of something like that in Nietzsche. I haven't read him in a while, but yeah, good point. Yes. Yeah. But I'm saying that piety and philosophy are. That philosophy without piety is sophistry. I mean, if there's anything you want to pick up from what I said, I think that's the main thing. That philosophy without piety is sophistry, which disqualifies quite a lot of philosophy. But I think without this pious dimension in Plato, and I think really the pious dimension in Plato is not, he doesn't bang on about it. Do you see what I mean? I think it's really accessed through sensitivity to the symbolic and the mythic. He just creates a sort of background of it, and those that have ears, let them hear. And many don't have ears, and instead kind of get involved with Plato as a sort of rationalistic. Wow, what's he saying? What's he not saying? What is he offering? What is he not offering? Plato's a literary man. He writes at a time where poetry is a little bit past its height. But as I said at the beginning, it's a civilization which is founded on poetry. So he very much writes aware of the glow that the words he uses have. And so this famous example of "I went down" is such an obvious case in point. And I think the more one becomes aware of the mythic dimension of Plato, the more one becomes aware of the pious, of the religious aspect of Plato, which is essential to philosophy. No truth without reverence. It's that simple.
Would you say, some scientists make this mistake too a bit, with desperation to prove something
Yes.
or be the one who gets there first or
Yes.
worse. Or someone who gets in a bit of a pickle.
They do get a bit of
It's a sort of similar kind of lack of reference to searching, would you say, maybe?
Yeah, and I wouldn't condemn. I mean, some scientists are incredibly in love with the universe in their own way. So yeah, no. But I think scientism. So this sort of over the sort of well, in a way, we have this idolatry because we revere the human intellect, and so we revere cognition, and we assume that cognition is a sort of faculty that is independent from the other faculty that I was talking about, pistis, trust. And Plato is very clear that one doesn't exist without the other, but we act as though it does. So our knowledge becomes it's sort of pointing towards very specific things, but in doing so it abstracts all kinds of other things, which is what one could argue the scientific method does, or has to do anyway. So yeah, so it's more to do with the sort of idolatrous worship of the human intellect. That is in fact a lack of reverence. Of course the human intellect has its place. I mean, it's a marvelous thing, but not without reverence.
For reverence, could you read humility?
You could. I'm sure I mean, one of the key things about reverence is that it directs us away from ourselves and towards all other things. So I'm sure humility is involved, but reverence is a kind of love, really. It's a kind of adoration, or how else can one say it? But that's why that's why Plato practices the love of wisdom rather than the unceasingly intellectual search for wisdom. It's actually an eros, it's a desire, and it's It's a philia as well, it's a befriending. But all these are kinds of love. It's all good love.
Just a point about reference. I was reading Richard Dawkins'
I've heard of him.
big book on called Breathing a Rainbow, in which he gets quite angry and he says something.
He gets angry, does he? That's interesting.
He gets angry that when people start to accuse of not having reverence, and claims he does in his great love of nature.
Yeah, it's interesting that, because I think and he's probably genuine about that. I do notice that that's what he's advocating, but he's sort of advocating two opposing positions, because he's also advocating a very, very narrow-minded version of science, I would argue. So on the one hand, he's an intellect worshipper. On the other hand, he's saying, no, but we revere nature, whilst all the time portraying nature as this kind of terrible, perpetual, in state of perpetual warfare, pitiless, indifferent place. But we revere it. We love it. It's great. It's a really odd kind of psychology that he has. But he's an odd sort. Man at the back.
In the bibliography, there are 7 studies of Plato. Can you choose one that you would particularly recommend?
Right, so that bibliography is only the books that I used while creating this lecture. Where is that? I don't have it, sorry. Sorry, you did give it to me, Stephen, I apologize. Thank you. The first 3 are good. I mean, as a good starting point, I would say Eva Braun's book, and possibly Friedlander's book as well, as sort of good introductions. It's very hard to find good introductions of Plato. But I think I do have a small piece of advice. There's really not... I think the best books on Plato are the books by already heavyweight thinkers that involve themselves with Plato. Someone who's already worth reading, if you know what I mean. Whatever thinker floats your boat, as it were, I think their involvement with Plato would be interesting. And I would recommend that rather than finding a good guide on Plato or a good introduction to Plato. Because they're already living it. You see, these questions are their concerns all the time. And they probably change their mind, and they've got their own little dialogue with Plato going on throughout their own kind of thinking. So I would certainly recommend that.
You give a note on the music of the Republic, which shows that music is part of your life. And I'm intrigued by the music.
You'd have to read that book. You'd have to read it. I think that's a good. I think that's a good introduction.
So much. A little bit.
I couldn't possibly do that for some reason. I'm sorry. Yeah, no, I've gone blank. I can't remember the book, or it sort of goes into one ear and out the other, much like most of Plato. It's true. I read it and I go, oh yeah, wow, that was in the dialogue, and then it's gone a moment later. So sorry, I'm a very bad librarian. But I seem to remember distinctly that book has many things. And it also has, it's not just about the Republic. It's got a good, one of the best essays in there is actually on the Timaeus. So it's just a good guide to have around, I think.
I don't recall what Plato said on music itself.
He says it's rubbish.
Well, I feared so, but that's not
No, I think within the context of the Republic, he's got a very specific take on music. I think that's the thing with Plato. It's like all good thinkers and writers, he's very contradictory, self-contradictory. So whatever opinion Socrates has in the Republic, it's not going to be the opinion that Socrates has in the Phaedo, and it's not going to be what the Eleatic stranger says. You know, it's all these, and so you're left to think, well, what are you saying? You're saying 7 different things, and that's exactly where he wants us to be. But I think the important thing to remember about reading Plato is that context is fundamental. Who is he talking to? What are they talking about? What are the characters really interested in when they ask Plato questions? So an obvious example of that is that little dialogue which everybody gets to read when they begin Plato, which is the Meno. And then Meno starts with the question, what is virtue? Or that's not the question it starts with. It starts with, can you tell me, Socrates, whether virtue can be teachable, or is it by nature, or some other way? So Meno assails Socrates with a zillion questions about virtue, but you soon find out that Meno is a very unvirtuous man and not at all interested in virtue. So then we think, okay, so Socrates' answers to Meno are depending on that. They're depending not on the words, but where, what is the character's motive here? Where is he coming from? So to one person, Socrates gives one answer, and in another context, he gives another answer. And I think that's true to life, right? And that's why this thing about in between, because it's not that Socrates says, well, I believe virtue is this. He is completely in the relay of tortures. That's where he's speaking from. So that's why his answers differ.
On that note, should we have some tea?